The moment froze like a painting. Kamala Harris, eyes blazing, voice cracking through the microphone, hurled her words across the stage like a storm with no warning. Her hands cut through the air, her tone sharp enough to slice the silence that had just moments before held the room in a delicate balance. For a heartbeat, it felt as if the walls themselves trembled under the force of her scream. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett did not move. She did not flinch. She did not even blink. In that instant, her stillness spoke louder than Harris's fury. The cameras caught it, every angle, every lens trained on the split screen of chaos and composure. Harris's jaw tight with rage, Crockett's face serene, a steady calm that unnerved even those who wanted to cheer the vice president on. Gasps rippled through the audience, some covering their mouths in disbelief, others pulling out their phones to capture the clash. The debate stage, meant to be a place of ideas, had become an arena. The spectacle was electric, charged with outrage, dripping with tension. And yet it was Crockett's silence, not Harris's scream, that everyone would remember in that moment. Online, the reaction was instantaneous. Tweets and posts exploded within seconds. Did Harris just lose it on national TV? Why is Crockett so calm? Clips spread like wildfire across feeds, hashtags forming in real time as if the internet itself had been waiting for this exact fracture to expose itself. The scream was loud, but the quiet that followed was deafening. Every critic, every cynic, every armchair analyst leaned forward, wondering if this would be the crack in the polished armor Harris had built over years. And more importantly, how would Crockett respond? Would she rise with equal fire, or would she let the moments slip away? The crowd's eyes shifted, breath held, waiting for the counterpunch. Harris's voice still echoed in the rafters, but the spotlight had already shifted. It no longer belonged to the vice president. It belonged to the woman standing across from her, still as stone, calm as glass. What happened next would silence every critic, every cynic, every doubter, and turn this night into a story no one could forget. This was no ordinary stage. The lights weren't just bright. They were unforgiving, magnifying every gesture, every tremor in a voice, every darting glance of unease. Millions were watching at home, scrolling through feeds, sharing clips within seconds. It wasn't just a debate. It was a live referendum on what America values in its leaders. And in that crucible, every word carried weight far heavier than the podiums could bear. For Kamala Harris, the stage was meant to be an arena of dominance, a reminder of her stature, her years in the highest offices of power. She walked onto it believing her voice would command obedience, her resume would silence dissent, and her presence would secure the upper hand before the first question was even asked. But presence can falter under pressure. Arrogance can unravel in the blink of an eye. And for Harris, that unraveling had already begun. For Jasmine Crockett, the stakes were different. She wasn't just another voice at the microphone. She was the embodiment of something larger. Every woman who'd been told to sit down. Every immigrant family who'd been told their story didn't count. Every community dismissed as too loud, too emotional, or too much. Her stillness was not passivity. It was defiant. It was dignity. It was the refusal to be reduced to a stereotype, even as Harris tried to drown her out with sheer volume. And that's why this clash mattered. To the outside eye, it was one politician screaming at another. But beneath the surface, it was a cultural battle being fought in real time. It was arrogance versus resilience. The politics of ego against the politics of lived truth. The country wasn't just listening to policies. It was watching a test of character. America wasn't deciding whose facts were sharper. It was deciding whose spirit could withstand the storm. Representation was on trial. Dignity was on trial. The unspoken question hanging in the air was simple yet seismic. When pushed to the edge, who really reflects the America we claim to be? Every debate in history has its moment. The freeze frame that gets replayed for years. The quote etched into memory. The clash that defines not just a campaign but an era. Tonight had just produced that moment. Harris's scream was the spark, but it was Crockett's response, or lack thereof, that would determine whether the spark fizzled or ignited into something far greater. And here's where the suspense sharpened. Crockett had yet to say a word. Not. The silence after Harris's eruption stretched like a taut wire across the room, vibrating with potential. It could snap at any second. The audience knew it, the moderators felt it, and Harris herself sensed it, though she masked the unease with more bravado. What happens when a scream collides with silence? When force meets immovable calm? History tells us that the louder voice isn't always the lasting one. Sometimes it is the steady presence, the deliberate pause that seizes the narrative. And on this night, That pause was pregnant with something larger than the room could hold. Because the reversal was coming. The scream was only the opening act. The true shock, the moment that would leave the nation speechless, was still waiting in the wings. And it would not be loud. It would not be chaotic. It would arrive with the precision of a scalpel, the clarity of truth, and the calm of someone who had carried storms far heavier than this one. The silence wasn't weakness, it was the calm before a reckoning. And soon, America would see it. Kamala Harris had built a career on projection. To the public eye she was polished, eloquent and steeped in authority. Her rise was meteoric, from district attorney to senator to vice president of the United States. To many she embodied success, the child of immigrants who had climbed to one of the highest offices in the land. Every stage she walked onto carried the shimmer of historic achievement. Every headline praised the barriers she had broken. And for years that aura seemed untouchable. But the closer one looked, the clearer the contradictions became. Harris crafted an image of calm sophistication, yet those who studied her speeches and interviews knew a different pattern. When challenged, when pressed past her talking points, her composure cracked. Behind the smile there lurked a tendency to lash out, to dismiss, to dominate by volume rather than persuasion. And as the cameras rolled, those moments grew harder to conceal. It wasn't the first time Americans had seen flashes of. They remembered the infamous interviews where she laughed awkwardly, deflecting rather than answering. They remembered her debates, during the 2020 campaign, moments when she shifted from charm to condescension in a matter of breath. They remembered how the very qualities she sold as strength, her sharpness, her quick wit, too often morphed into barbed arrogance. These were not minor stumbles, they were glimpses behind the curtain, reminders that her projection of control could buckle under the weight of scrutiny. Sound bites lingered. That little girl was me. The line that had once drawn applause later felt hollow when alliances shifted. Don't lecture me. The snap she had delivered on live television, a reminder of how quickly her tone could curve. The longer she remained in the spotlight, the more her contradictions began to define her narrative. Was she the symbol of progress, or a politician masking insecurity with bravado? Her defenders insisted she was simply passionate, fiery, unwilling to back down. But passion has a razor's edge. What some saw as fire, others recognized as fragility, the inability to withstand challenge without reverting to attack. And tonight, under the brightest lights, that fragility was no longer a rumor, it was a spectacle. Harris believed power was her shield. Years of titles and accolades had insulated her from consequences that might humble a lesser figure. But power can also breed blindness. Surrounded by staff who nodded, by headlines that lauded, she learned to equate volume with victory. Yet in politics, as in life, the stage always strips away the layers. When the lights are hottest, the mask slips. And that is why her scream mattered. It wasn't simply a burst of frustration. It was the culmination of years of pressure building behind a carefully constructed image. The Vice President of the United States, a woman who had positioned herself as a model of historic dignity, had been rattled. The control she had long prided herself on evaporated in an instant. And in its place, the nation saw raw anger, untempered and uncalculated. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years Harris had accused others of lacking composure, of being too emotional, of losing their grip in the heat of battle. Yet here she was, undone by the very flaw she had weaponized against others. It was hypocrisy made flesh, a performance of strength, collapsing into a spectacle of fragility. And the audience knew it. They weren't just reacting to her words. They were reacting to the break in the mask. A scream is more than noise. It is confession. It tells the world that control has been lost, that ego has overtaken reason. Harris's scream, captured in high definition and broadcast across every screen, was her confession. Yet the tension wasn't in the scream itself. It was in what it revealed. Every politician has flaws, but few allow the nation to see them so nakedly. Harris had spent decades layering polish over her sharp edges. But tonight, those cracks split wide open. The arrogance that once carried her now betrayed her. And standing across from her was Jasmine Crockett, embodying the very opposite. Calm where Harris was chaotic, still where Harris was frantic. The contrast was cinematic, almost too perfect for reality. One woman clawing for control, another embodying it effortlessly. The hero-villain polarity wrote itself. The stage had become a mirror. Harris, the vice president, projected the fragility of power when stripped of polish. Crockett projected the resilience of dignity when tested by fire. And as Harris's voice echoed into silence, every contradiction of her career condensed into that one explosive moment. Tonight, all those cracks were about to shatter in public view, and once shattered, no amount of spin, no polished interview, no rehearsed smile would ever fully piece them back together again. The world had seen behind the curtain. The fall had already begun. Jasmine Crockett's calm on that stage did not appear overnight. It was not the kind of stillness born from privilege, or the quiet confidence of someone who had never been tested. It was the product of a life shaped by grit, sharpened by struggle, and defined by the refusal to let circumstance dictate destiny. To understand why she stood so unshaken in the face of Kamala Harris's rage, one has to journey back to the roots that made her who she is. Crockett's story begins far from the gleaming lights of Washington. She was raised in a world where every opportunity had to be wrestled from clenched fists, where the voices of people like her were too often ignored or dismissed. From an early age, she understood that survival was not guaranteed, and respect was never handed over free. If she wanted her place at the table, she would have to carve it herself. School was not simply about learning for Jasmine. It was about proving she could excel despite being underestimated, proving that her sharp mind could not be dulled by doubt, proving that her voice, though often told it was too loud, carried truths that could not be silenced. She spoke up in classrooms where others stayed quiet, defended friends who were bullied, and questioned authority when rules reeked of injustice. The seeds of the fighter she would become were planted early, but it wasn't easy. Her family carried the weight of sacrifice, working long hours, enduring the indignities that so many immigrant and working-class families face, just to keep food on the table and lights on in the house. Jasmine saw this, she felt it, she carried it, and rather than let that hardship harden her into bitterness, it shaped her into steel, resilient, unbending, unwilling to allow the struggles of her family to be in vain. When she pursued law, she did so not to join the ranks of the comfortable, but to defend those who had no one else. Her clients were not the powerful, they were the forgotten, families evicted without cause, workers cheated of wages, communities torn apart by systems designed to keep them voiceless. In every courtroom she carried herself with the same calm she would one day bring to the stage, measured, deliberate, refusing to be baited into anger even when the odds were stacked against her. Her opponents underestimated her again and again. They mistook her youth, her gender, her background for weakness. They believed that if they raised their voices, if they tried to intimidate, she would back down. Instead, she absorbed their fire and responded with facts, with evidence, with the quiet authority of someone who had weathered storms far fiercer than theirs. And time after time she won, not always in verdicts, but in respect, in the recognition that she was a force who would not be broken. Her rise to Congress was never inevitable, it was improbable. She fought for every vote, every dollar, every ounce of credibility. The establishment did not roll out a red carpet. Instead, she met skepticism, doubt, and even hostility. Too unpolished, too direct, too real. But what others labeled as flaws, her supporters recognized as authenticity. Jasmine Crockett was not trying to be anyone else. She did not sand down her edges to fit the mold of a politician. She stood as she was, sharp, honest, unapologetically herself. And that, perhaps, was her greatest strength. In an age of rehearsed soundbites and manufactured personas, Crockett's presence felt raw, unfiltered, undeniable. She represented something larger than herself, the resilience of communities too often erased, the pride of identities too often attacked, the dignity of people who refuse to bow even when the world tells them to bend. So when she stepped onto that debate stage opposite Kamala Harris, she did not bring nerves or doubt. She brought with her the weight of her journey. She brought the faces of her family, the voices of her clients, the support of every voter who had chosen her because she spoke with the same fire they felt in their bones. She brought history, sacrifice, and resilience, woven into every fiber of her being. And that's why when Harris screamed, Jasmine Crockett stood still, because she had been here before, in 1,000 different forms. She had faced louder voices, harsher critics, more dangerous stakes. She had endured dismissals, mockery, and attacks, far more personal than anything Harris could deliver. And each time she had survived, each time she had grown stronger. Her calm was not weakness, it was triumph. It was the armor forged in the fires of a lifetime of proving herself. It was the discipline of a woman who understood that dignity is louder than rage, and composure can cut deeper than any scream. The audience might not have known her full story, but in that moment, they could feel it.
They could sense that this was not a politician stumbling into luck, but a fighter stepping into destiny. For Crockett, this debate was not simply another political clash. It was the culmination of everything she had endured, everything she had fought for. She wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for everyone who had ever been underestimated, shouted down, dismissed, or erased. Her reply, when it came, would not just be words. It would be the echo of a lifetime of resilience. The roar of dignity carried on a whisper of calm. It was this very resilience that made her ready for the storm Harris unleashed, and it was this very resilience that would soon turn the vice president's scream into the most costly mistake of her career. The debate hall, already tense, began to vibrate with a new intensity. Harris, unwilling to let the silence linger, pressed forward with renewed force. Her voice climbed higher, her cadence sharper, each sentence overlapping the last, like waves crashing against a wall. She interrupted, cut off the moderator, cut off Crockett, cut off even the rhythm of her own argument. It was less a debate now than a spectacle, an outpouring of frustration wrapped in the armor of authority. The audience reacted in real time. Some cheered, clapping with a fervor that bordered on desperation, as though volume alone could transform Harris's fury into strength. Others groaned audibly, shaking their heads, uneasy with the sheer aggression flooding the stage. A few booed, their voices small but cutting, puncturing the illusion of total control Harris had hoped to project. The hall was no longer united in quiet observation. It was fractured, restless, alive with conflict, and through it all Jasmine Crockett stood motionless. She did not attempt to interject. She did not roll her eyes or raise her hand. She simply watched, steady as a mountain against the storm. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the contrast in high definition. Harris, animated, sweating, her voice pushing past the microphone's limits. Crockett, serene, her expression unreadable, her eyes unflinching. Every second of Crockett's silence carried weight. It wasn't the silence of someone defeated, nor the silence of someone unsure. It was the silence of calculation, of patience, of someone who understood that sometimes the most powerful statement is the refusal to be dragged into chaos. And the audience felt it. Each pause stretched further, each unspoken word more deafening than the scream that had come before. Harris seemed to sense it too, though she tried to cover it with more bluster. Her words became less sharp, more repetitive. The same accusations, the same digs, recycled with diminishing impact. It was as if she was throwing everything she had into the fire, hoping something would burn Crockett down. But the flames met stone, and the stone refused to move. The crowd grew restless. Murmurs spread through the rows. The tension became unbearable. The split in the audience sharper. Supporters of Harris shouted louder, trying to drown out the growing unease. Supporters of Crockett leaned forward, waiting, knowing something was coming. And the undecided, those who had walked in unsure, watched with wide eyes, realizing they were witnessing something bigger than politics.
Cameras flashed, phones recorded, journalists scribbled furiously. But no pen, no lens, no live stream could fully capture the electric weight of that silence. It wasn't just Crockett listening, it was the entire nation holding its breath. Then Harris, visibly rattled, delivered one final line. She spat it out with the force of someone convinced it would end the debate, punctuating it with a finger jab toward Crockett. The words echoed, bouncing through the hall, hanging in the air like a challenge thrown at the feet of her opponent. And still Crockett said nothing. She inhaled slowly, visibly, deliberately. The kind of breath you take not when you're nervous, but when you're ready. The room shifted, the audience felt it. The pivot, the tilt of gravity, as if the entire hall had leaned toward her in expectation. Even Harris faltered, her momentum crashing against the sudden stillness, her hand lowering as her voice cracked into silence. In that moment, Crockett had seized the stage without uttering a single word. The hush was total, an orchestra of anticipation. The crowd, the moderators, the cameras, the nation, they were no longer watching Harris. They were waiting for Jasmine. And then, with one breath, the tables turned. The pause seemed endless. Crockett let the silence hang, refusing to rush into Harris's chaos, refusing to dignify the scream with a frantic rebuttal. Instead, she drew in a slow breath, her shoulders steady, her gaze fixed, not at the cameras, not at the audience, but directly at Harris. The vice president, still flushed, fidgeted with her notes, as if suddenly aware that her words had not landed as intended. The hall leaned in, every heartbeat sinking to the stillness radiating from Crockett's side of the stage. When she finally spoke, it was not with volume, but with clarity. Her voice was low, measured, slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. "Madam Vice President," she began, the calm respect in her tone making the title sound less like reverence and more like indictment. "I hear the anger in your voice, but what this country needs right now isn't anger, it's answers." The effect was instantaneous. The audience gasped, an audible intake of breath, as though the entire hall had been struck at once. Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. The sharpness of her words came from their restraint, their refusal to descend into the same fury that had consumed Harris. Where Harris had bellowed, Crockett whispered, and the whisper thundered louder than any scream. She let the moment linger, scanning the room before continuing. "You've had years in the highest offices of this land," Crockett said, each word deliberate enough to sting. "And yet, here we are, still searching for solutions, still waiting for leadership that puts people before pride. Yelling at me won't change that reality, and yelling at the American people won't erase their struggles." The hall erupted in murmurs, phones lifting higher, cameras zooming closer. Harris shifted uneasily, her lips pressed tight as though every syllable had drawn fresh cracks across her composure. Crockett pressed forward, not in speed but in weight. She wielded facts like blades, unsheathing them one by one. She cited the rising costs families were drowning under, the promises made and forgotten, the communities crying out for relief. "These aren't my words alone," she said, turning slightly toward the audience. "These are the words of mothers and fathers I've sat with in living rooms, where rent is overdue, of students who fear their debt will outlive them, of workers whose wages haven't stretched in years. They don't need theatrics, they need truth." Every example was precise, each statistic anchored in lived experience. It wasn't abstract policy, it was the lived suffering of Americans given voice on that stage. And in the contrast, Harris's rant began to look small, hollow, like an echo bouncing in an empty chamber. But Crockett didn't stop there. She pivoted, gracefully but firmly, to the personal. "I've been underestimated before," she said, her tone softening but her eyes unyielding. "I've been shouted down, laughed at, dismissed. But every time I stood, not for myself, but for those who couldn't stand where I did. My calm tonight isn't silence, it's strength, because dignity," she paused, the word ringing out like a bell, "will always speak louder than rage." The audience broke into applause, scattered at first, then swelling, rolling through the hall in waves. Some stood, clapping with the kind of release that comes when someone says exactly what needed to be said. The moderators leaned forward, stunned, caught between the duty of neutrality and the undeniable electricity of the moment. Harris, for the first time, looked small, her shoulders hunched, her gaze darted, not at Crockett, not at the audience, but downward, toward the mask of confidence, the veneer of command, had slipped completely. In her place stood a politician suddenly aware that power is not only measured in titles or in volume, but in the ability to remain unbroken when tested. Crockett leaned in slightly, never aggressive, but commanding the room nonetheless. "You see, leadership isn't proven when the cameras are easy, when the applause is guaranteed. Leadership is proven when the crowd is divided, when the criticism is sharp, when the pressure is suffocating. And in those moments, true leaders don't scream, they stand." Phones lit up across the audience, the glow of countless recordings capturing history in real time. Social feeds flooded within seconds. Crockett just destroyed Harris, the calmest takedown in debate history. Clips raced across timelines faster than moderators could regain control. The debate stage had become a courtroom, and Crockett had just delivered her closing argument. She ended not with a flourish but with finality. "So, Madam Vice President, if the best you can offer this country is anger, then maybe, just maybe, it's time to let someone else offer answers." The silence that followed was louder than applause. For a beat, the hall held its breath, the weight of the words settling into every seat, every screen, every heart watching. And then, as though released from spell, the audience exploded. Cheers, applause, a standing ovation that rattled the raft. Even those who hadn't chosen sides rose to their feet, swept up in the recognition that they had just witnessed a turning point. Harris's face told the rest of the story. The tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, the shift of her stance, The glance toward her staff off stage. She knew this wasn't just a bad moment. It was the moment. The one that would outlive the campaign. The one that would replay endlessly in highlight reels. The one that stripped away years of carefully constructed armor. And Crockett, she didn't revel, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply stood, calm as she had been from the start, allowing the ovation to swell around her, allowing the history of the moment to belong not just to her, but to everyone she had spoken for. Her reply wasn't crafted for applause. It was crafted for truth. That the applause came anyway was proof of its power. It wasn't just a reply. It was a revelation. A revelation. A revelation that arrogance could be unmasked by dignity. That volume could be silenced by calm. That history does not always favor the loudest voice, but the truest one. And as the ovation thundered on, as cameras beamed her words into millions of homes, Jasmine Crockett had transformed from participant to symbol, from congresswoman to conscience, from underdog to undeniable. But what no one yet realized was that this revelation was only the beginning. The shockwaves were about to spread far beyond the walls of that debate hall. The internet, the news cycle, the very narrative of power in America, all of it was about to bend around this moment. And Harris's scream would be remembered, yes, but only as the backdrop to the calm that dismantled it. The ovation was still echoing through the rafters when the first clips hit the internet. Within seconds, phones in the audience had pushed Crockett's words into the bloodstream of social media, where velocity mattered more than verdicts. By the time the moderators attempted to steer the debate back on course, TikTok was already ablaze. The clip, Harris screaming, Crockett, standing stone still, followed by the calm reply that sliced through the noise, was spreading like wildfire. Hashtags erupted almost instantly. Calm wins. Crockett TVs. Harris. Dignity over drama. Even the more playful ones. Mic drop moment. And she stood still. Were climbing into trending territory. On Twitter, the phrase "this wasn't a reply, it was a revelation" circulated with lightning speed, quoted by influencers, activists, and ordinary viewers who felt seen in Crockett's poise. The memes were relentless. Harris frozen mid-scream beside Crockett's serene face. Captions reading, "When your boss yells but you already have another job lined up," or "Volume nail victory." What had been a tense political showdown was transforming into a cultural touchstone. Late-night comedy shows wasted no time. Monologues the very next evening played and replayed the clip, comedians drawing laughs with impersonations of Harris's outburst, followed by exaggerated whispers, mimicking Crockett's calm rebuttal. The audiences roared, but beneath the laughter was acknowledgement. Something seismic had shifted. Even comedy, often dismissed as mere entertainment, was shaping public perception. Harris wasn't commanding, she was flailing. Commentators across networks scrambled to frame the fallout. Some tried to minimize the damage, arguing that debates get heated, that strong emotion shows passion, but those defenses rang hollow against the tidal wave of commentary declaring Crockett the clear victor. Crockett didn't just win the exchange, one anchor said bluntly. She redefined it. She reminded America that leadership doesn't scream. Leadership listens, waits, and then speaks truth that cannot be shouted down. Celebrities joined the chorus, amplifying Crockett's moment to audiences far beyond politics. A-list actors posted clips on Instagram stories with fire emoji. Musicians tweeted lyrics about silence being louder than noise. Activists and authors hailed it as the rebuke America needed to see. Within 24 hours, Crockett's name had generated more Google searches than Harris's entire campaign rollout months earlier. Even those who had never followed a debate were suddenly invested. College students were quoting Crockett in dorm rooms. Workers on lunch breaks were showing the clip around tables. Parents shared it with children as an example of strength without aggression. The narrative had shifted so profoundly that Harris's scream, intended as a show of dominance, was now remembered only as the setup for Crockett's takedown. What made it sting even more for Harris was the bipartisan echo. While progressives cheered Crockett's dignity, even some moderates and conservatives conceded she had carried herself with the gravitas of a true leader. "I may not agree with her politics," one commentator admitted, "but you can't deny the composure." Harris lost control, Crockett kept it. The consensus was rare, and that rarity gave it weight. News outlets plastered Crockett's image across front pages. Opinion pieces dissected her delivery, comparing her restraint to iconic political moments where stillness triumphed over spectacle. Some drew parallels to Kennedy's calm beside Nixon's sweat, others to Obama's measured composure against louder opponents. Crockett was now being written into that lineage, not as a footnote,
but as a turning point. Meanwhile, Harris's team scrambled to do damage control. Press releases emphasized her passion, her fight, her refusal to back down. Yet each attempt only reignited the viral clip, reminding viewers of the scream that had sparked it all. Passion, one viral tweet scoffed. That wasn't passion, that was pan. The most devastating blow, however, came not from pundits or partisans, but from ordinary citizens who began posting their own stories under the hashtag #CalmWins. Nurses shared moments when they stayed calm in emergencies. Teachers recalled de-escalating chaos in classrooms. Immigrants described enduring insults with quiet dignity. Crockett's calm reply had become more than a debate moment. It had become a mirror for resilience itself, one millions could see themselves in. And just like that, Harris was no longer the focus of the story. She had been eclipsed, her scream reduced to background noise in a narrative that belonged entirely to her opponent. The clip that would replay endlessly wasn't her fury, but Crockett's unshakable calm, the calm that turned a debate into a revelation. But if the digital world was roaring in Crockett's favor, the political world was bracing for impact. Campaign war rooms across the country were recalculating, strategists reevaluating. The question was no longer did Harris stumble, but has Crockett just rewritten the shockwaves had only begun to ripple outward. The crowd had witnessed the spark, the internet had carried the flame, and now the establishment itself was about to face the fire. In the end, what the nation witnessed on that stage was not just a clash between two politicians, it was a living parable. Crockett's composure, her refusal to be dragged into the mud, revealed something larger than politics. It reminded America that strength is not measured in decibels, nor is leadership found in the ability to shout the loudest. True power comes from the courage to remain steady when the world demands you. The image of Harris mid-scream and Crockett still as stone has already taken its place among the unforgettable snapshots of political life. But beyond the viral moment lies a universal truth. When arrogance tries to dominate, dignity is the only response that endures. Harris's fury may have rattled the stage, but it was Crockett's calm truth that owned it, reshaping the narrative in real time. That is why the clip resonated far beyond Washington, because every person watching could see themselves in that moment. Who hasn't faced a boss who yelled to assert power? Who hasn't been underestimated, talked over, dismissed, or cornered by someone convinced their volume equaled authority? And who hasn't dreamed of answering not with rage, but with calm precision that silences a room? Crockett gave voice to that dream. She embodied the dignity so many long to hold onto in their own battles. Her moment was not an accident. It was born from years of resilience, from a life forged in struggle, and from the unshakable belief that truth doesn't need to shout, it only needs to stand. Crockett's calm was not weakness, it was resistance. It was defiant. It was the quiet roar of someone who has carried the weight of doubt, prejudice, and challenge, and emerged unbroken. This is the lesson America was left with. Dignity is not passive, it is active. It is a choice made in the heat of conflict, a discipline that takes more courage than fury ever will. Harris raised her voice to seize control. Crockett held her silence to show she never lost it. In that contrast lay the real victory. For those watching at home, it became more than political theater. It became instruction. The immigrant who endures insults while chasing the promise of a better life. The woman overlooked in the boardroom who knows her worth regardless of who interrupts. The young activist marching for justice in the face of jeers. Crockett's calm stood for all of them. It said, "You do not need to match arrogance with arrogance. You need only stand, rooted in truth, and let the arrogance unravel itself." And that is what makes this moment timeless. Politicians will rise and fall, debates will come and go, but the moral clarity of this exchange endures. Crockett reminded the nation that in the face of arrogance, calm truth always wins. It may not be immediate, it may not come with applause in every room, but it resonates, it shifts perceptions, it teaches, it lasts. For America, this was not just a debate, it was a reflection of its own struggle, a nation too often divided by rage, by those who scream to drown out dissent, caught a glimpse of another path, one of resilience, composure, and justice. Crockett's calm reply became more than a rebuttal, it became a mirror of the American spirit at its best, the refusal to be broken by noise, the insistence on answering chaos with clarity. And as the cameras cut, as the hashtags surged, as history tucked away another story, the lesson was already seeping into the bones of those who watched. Dignity is undefeated, it does not age, it does not falter, it does not need to be explained. What Harris's scream tried to erase, Crockett's calm restored, and in that restoration, America was reminded of who it can be. So the challenge now is not just to remember the moment, but to live it, to carry Crockett's stillness into boardrooms, classrooms, neighborhoods and march, to meet arrogance not with rage, but with a dignity that leaves arrogance trembling. Because in every battle, great or small, there is always that choice, and when the choice comes, when the voices rise, when the room shakes, when the world demands you break, remember this night. Remember that calm truth doesn't just win debates, it wins hearts, it wins respect, it wins history. Kamala screamed, Crockett replied, and the world remembered her calm. That single contrast, rage on one side, composure on the other, became the story etched into millions of minds. It wasn't just a debate stage, it was a crossroads where arrogance met dignity, and dignity walked away carrying the moment. In a world where noise dominates, where anger is too often mistaken for strength, this moment cut through the static. Crockett showed that dignity is not silence, it is power, it is the force that steadies the storm, the truth that cannot be shaken, the voice that doesn't need to shout, to be heard. That's why this story matters far beyond politics. It matters for every person who has ever been underestimated, for every immigrant who has been told they don't belong, for every fighter who has been mocked for refusing to bow to arrogance. This moment proved what we already knew in our bones. Calm truth carries further than rage ever can. And now the choice is ours. We can let the clip fade into another trending hashtag, or we can turn it into a movement. If you believe in the power of dignity, if you believe voices like Crockett's deserve to rise above the noise, then share this story, subscribe to this channel, be part of the community that chooses resilience over fury, clarity over chaos, dignity over arrogance, because this isn't just about one debate, it's about what kind of America we want to live in, what kind of people we choose to be, and what kind of truth we want history to remember. Because when arrogance meets dignity, dignity always wins.